very warm welcome to everyone here for what is effectively our second Leadership for Good seminar. At the outset, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm hosting this webinar from the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and also celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing cultures and connections to the land and waters of Australia. My name's Clinton Free. I'm now the Deputy Dean of the Business School, and formerly I took a role in leading executive education in the Business School. And it's a great delight to welcome you here to this talk, which is part of a series which is intended to promote the university's values through discussions with prominent Australians. The series is a collaboration between HR, the university's culture strategy and the Business School, and it sits alongside a series of development programs that we are offering for our university leaders, and I can see many of whom are in the participants to this webinar. We've also opened up the talk today to a couple of other members of our University of Community, and it's great to have everyone together. I know for me and for many, the Tokyo Olympics provided one of the most gripping events of 2021, and it certainly uplifted and inspired our nation at a time when people were dealing with the devastating impact of COVID. The performance of our athletes was nothing short of exceptional and inspirational, and like all good things, the University of Sydney was at the forefront of this performance, contributing 36 athletes that were current or former students of the University of Sydney to the Australian team, and I believe one athlete in the Canadian team. We have the good fortune of having two of those stars in conversation today, and it's a conversation that will touch upon issues of high performance, of courage and execution under pressure. We also have the good fortune of having our university's Director of Culture Strategy, Tim Soutphommasane, who I should add is also a very useful man with a cricket bat and cricket ball in his own right to lead the conversation. There will be an opportunity for Q&A at the back end of the session today, and we're using Slido for the purposes of the Q&A. And Steph, it would be great if you could just pop into chat the link to pop questions in. So Steph has just put that into chat for you to ask questions. It's now my great pleasure to pass over to Tim to kick off our second and very eagerly awaited Leadership for Good talk. Thanks, Tim.
Oh, thanks so much, Clinton. And Clinton's far too modest to mention that he was a University Blue at Oxford in cricket. So my cricketing prowess pales in comparison to my distinguished colleague. But friends, welcome to our second Leadership for Good talk, and my great honour today to introduce Rowan Browning and Harriet Hudson, two of our university Olympians, and they're going to reflect on their time at Tokyo with us and help us relive some of those great memories from a little over 2 months ago. It's hard to believe that it was only that long ago that we had the Olympic Games. It feels like so much has happened since then, albeit in lockdown, if you've been in Sydney. Let me introduce Rowan Browning first. Born and bred in Sydney, Rowan is currently studying a combined arts and law degree at the university, where he's a Collins Peasley Scholar. A sprinter on the track in Tokyo, Rowan won his 100-metre heat in a blistering personal best time of 10.01 seconds, the second fastest time an Australian has ever run. And on the way, beat the second fastest man in history, Johan Blake, as well. In his semi-final, Rowan ran 10.09 seconds, falling just short of qualifying for the event final. And off the track,
Charlotte,
won
Harriet.
A devoted following in light of his Olympic performance, and has come to be known too for his glorious mullet. So Rowan, I'm joining you in the spirit of the mullet here. I've been refraining from cutting my hair the last few weeks in anticipation of our conversation today. You might be the flying mullet, I'll be the lumbering mullet in this conversation.
For better or worse.
Also great to welcome Harriet Hudson, who's joining us from Queensland. I should add, Rowan's joining us from Melbourne. He's in his last day of hotel quarantine down in Melbourne. Harriet's joining us in Queensland, and Harriet grew up in the Darling Downs region there, attending school in Brisbane, where she first took up rowing. In 2016, she moved to Sydney to study at the university, and she's currently in the final year of her Bachelor of Applied Science in Occupational Therapy. Harriet first represented Australia in the world stage in 2016 at the World Rowing Junior Championships in Rotterdam, and she's gone on to represent Australia at the 2017, 18 and 19 World Rowing Under-23 Championships. And at Tokyo, sitting alongside Rowena Meredith, Caitlin Cronin and Ria Thompson, Harriet won an Olympic bronze in the quadruple scull. So welcome, Harriet and Rowan. Let's get into a bit of a chat now. Obviously, no spoilers. We know how you fared at the Olympics, Rowan and Harriet, but I'm really interested in just hearing each of you talk us through what your games experience was like and how you reflect on it a little over 2 months since it all wrapped up. Rowan, let's start with you.
Yeah, well, I mean, I have sort of been on the go ever since the Olympics. I went to Europe and ran the professional circuit for the past 2 months, which was a unique experience, a challenge in and of itself. And I can sort of talk about that later if it's of interest at all. But I'd say my Olympic experience was bizarre is one word, overwhelming is another, but overwhelmingly positive, I think. And it's funny, it's one of those things where I went to the Olympics with a lot of belief, and it was belief to make the final and win a medal. That's what any athlete has to approach competition like that. Otherwise, you're just not in with a shot at all. And it sort of never really occurred to me that I was ranked 40th in the world and completely out of the mix on paper. And I think that probably sums up the sort of mentality that I had going into the games. And I had this very special moment, which was my heat, winning that. And I think, surprising a lot of people. But, I think a lot of people really emphasized that and probably lost sight of the fact that, it's a heat, which is just the first round of a championship. And it's really the semi-final and then making the final, which is the most crucial thing. So, I definitely walked away feeling as if I'd sort of underperformed. And I think that's quite normal for any elite athlete. But overall, it was a great learning experience.
Well, Rowan, you had the whole nation cheering from you, and I think your semi-final run was one of the most watched events of the Olympic Games. Looking back on it now, you've mentioned that you go into an event like that trying to win, if not medal. How do you reflect on how you went? Do you think that you would have done anything differently with the benefit of hindsight?
Well, I think that I would do things better in the future with the benefit of having sort of learnt lessons rather than, with hindsight, because the experience for me was just truly bizarre. I mean, after the heat, my phone blew up. I think I attracted like 50,000 Instagram followers overnight or something ridiculous. And, if that's the metric, that's probably the metric of modern day, success in the sporting realm, I suppose, in some ways, which is a shame. But I think that it was just this incredible social phenomenon where I think in terms of like sort of the attention that came my way after the heat, it just never felt commensurate with my result. I didn't win a medal or anything like that. I finished 13th, which isn't bad, but it's definitely nothing special. And so I'd always gone into the games thinking that this is my first Olympics. It's a good opportunity to learn. And, there were a lot of lessons that I did learn, and even just day-to-day practical things like after the heat, my phone was blowing up. I went into, that night after the heat just full of adrenaline and slept something like 4 hours. I slept in until 1 p.m. The next day, which shows how late I went to bed. And then, turned up for the semi-final and I was just utterly exhausted. And I think that it's sort of being temperate and managing that sort of internal reaction that, and as well as the external attention, that was something that I needed to experience at some point. You sort of need to cut your teeth and be blooded a little bit before you can, really master that sort of scenario.
Well, Rowan, we'll go into that in a bit more detail later on in the chat. I really have a few questions for you on that front, but I want to bring Harriet in. Harriet, can you talk us through your Olympic experience and the path to the final in the quad sculls and your bronze medal?
Yeah, absolutely. I suppose for me, it was, well, for our crew, it was a dream come true. A podium finish was certainly something that we were aiming for, but I suppose it's not always what you get, especially at an Olympic Games. So I was selected in the women's quadruple scull, which was a boat that actually hadn't even qualified prior to this year. So my crew and I had to go over to Switzerland, to Lucerne, and compete in the final qualification regatta, which is also known as the Regatta of Death. The reason for this is because there is only 2 Olympic qualification spots left for each boat class. So I suppose in hindsight, this was probably a blessing in disguise for us, because it meant that we were able to have that international racing experience, which the rest of the Australian rowing team was unable to have because of COVID. We then, I suppose our run into the Olympics was certainly far from perfect. After being overseas for just 10 days, we had to come back and do a 2-week hotel quarantine stint, which meant time out of the boat. And then we had just a few short weeks before we went over to Tokyo. And we only had 5 days before our event to be able to go into our regatta centre. Normally we would have a lot longer than 5 days before an event like the Olympics. And that's because I suppose it's important to acclimatise. Tokyo was incredibly hot and humid, which was completely different to the weather that we're experiencing here in Australia with winter. And it's also just important to, I suppose, familiarise yourself with the course. In rowing, it's really important. Wind plays a huge factor. So just knowing the way that the wind kind of funnels down the course is really important. So only having 5 days was tricky. And of course, every crew from other countries are also there doing the same thing as you. So the water can be incredibly rough and rolly. So really we didn't have one perfect row before our heat. And then I suppose we were all debutantes in my crew, so it was our first Olympics. And for the heat, I think that we let the awe and the nervousness surrounding being in our first Olympics kind of come into our boat. And in the end, that affected our performance in the heat. So we came 5th out of 6 crews. So certainly not where we were hoping to be. In the moment following that heat, we came together as a crew and we just spoke about the fact that this wasn't where we wanted to be. This wasn't where we probably should have been, and that we needed to just make some really minor adjustments from there to the repechage, which is kind of like a second chance for us to get into the final. So that's another race, and we had to commit to those changes from that moment onwards, basically. And in reflection, I think that was certainly a time or a moment that could have gone either way. I suppose it would have been very easy for us to say, look, yeah, we've come 5th here. We've probably, we qualified in those last 2 positions anyway. So sitting around 10th is probably where we should be. But I suppose, because we had that goal as a crew to get onto that podium, we really committed to those changes. And then our repechage and final were a lot better.
Well, congratulations. Very proud of both of you for what you've achieved at the Olympic Games. And I know the university community was abuzz with the news of your results. Most of our university students, Rowan and Harriet, would see their studies as the most important part of their identity at this stage of their lives and their careers. But as elite athletes dedicated to your sport and performing at the very highest levels, I'm interested in asking you, where does your studies fit into the big picture for you, and what role has Sydney University played in your sporting career to date? Rowan, I might turn to you first.
Well, I'm in my 7th year of a 5-year degree, so I think the uni has been so flexible around, some of my commitments, which has just been fantastic. And I mean, some of my lecturers and tutors and unit coordinators might be in here. I'm not sure. I haven't seen the list of names, but if you are, thank you for all the flexibility that you have afforded, me personally. And certainly the EAP and the Sydney Uni Sport and Fitness has been really, really helpful. I think the thing about sport is it has this deadline. And so my studies have certainly taken a back seat. And it has led to this sort of juggling of priorities where when I have to make choices between one or the other, you always try to juggle them the best as possible, but I'll always go towards sport because I just have this narrow window to try and make something out of it. Whereas I always know that you can study in a flexible way. I also think that they're really nice complements. I mean, sport can be so demanding in the sense that, I would train usually maybe like 4, but a maximum of 5 hours a day, never any more than that, which is less of an hourly commitment than a lot of full-time jobs. Or, if you were like working in a startup or something like that. I have good mates who are working in startups, who work significantly longer hours than that. But it's more the fact that it's a 24-hour a day, 365-day year commitment, in the sense that it leaks into every element of your life. What time you go to bed, the sort of foods that you can eat. It limits your ability to go on holiday and that sort of thing, because you always have to be in a position to try and squeeze the last 1% out of training. And that means really rigid routines and a lot of dullness, to be honest. So, it's been one of those things where the university has been very, very helpful, but I think they complement each other nicely. Because of that reason, there's still enough hours in the day to study. There's still enough hours in the day to do certain units. Track and field at the professional level is a very global sport. The professional circuit's in Europe, so it's difficult sometimes with time differences. I mean, and flexibility goes a long way with that. The last exams that I did were for semester 1. Like I did 3 units last semester. I'm now at the part of my degree where I'm doing the final year of law. So it's full-time law. I finished my arts degree. And I had to leave Sydney on the first day that there were cases, because I had a training camp in Queensland and I was worried that the borders would be shut. This was pre-Olympics, obviously. So I brought my flights forward, flew to Brisbane, stayed in the Ibis that night. The next morning I got up and I had an exam, a law exam, and I had to check out at, I think it was like 10:30. I was in the Ibis at Brisbane airport, and I had no Wi-Fi there. So I was hotspotting from my phone, and I think I had to check out at 10:30 and the exam started at like 9 a.m. or something. So I was sitting there hotspotting from my phone, trying to do this exam, waiting to be evicted from this hotel room and being charged every 30 minutes that I was staying over. So, you find yourself in these funny sorts of situations that are definitely they're not like the best way to sit exams necessarily, but you just learn to roll with the punches and adapt on the fly. I think that's one of the most important qualities in sport. It's something, certainly a skill that you learn in spades when you're on the road.
Oh, indeed. Or it sounds like you've handled it with much aplomb, Rowan. Harriet, what about you? How do you make sense of your studies, and how does it fit into the big picture given what you do with rowing?
Yeah, I think, Rowan touched on it really well. I think that rowing and uni are a great partnership. University always encourages personal development, and for me, that a huge amount of that comes through my sport. Like Rowan said, it teaches you to be incredibly organised, proactive, and time efficient. So it's a great thing to have. And I study occupational therapy at the uni, and I've had a huge amount of support from my lecturers and tutors and things, which certainly makes life a lot easier, because I do think it's really important to have something else outside of your sport, because it's very easy to kind of I suppose get caught up in the day to day of training 3 times a day and trying to hit these performance targets and things like that. So having so I suppose studying it kind of enables you to take a step away from that and maybe have a little bit more perspective. So yeah, I really enjoy studying whilst rowing, and for as long as I row, I will certainly continue to study. So I might be racking up a couple more degrees. We'll see.
Well, lifelong learning, Harriet. I think that's the motto we all got to follow here. And to our audience, thank you for sending in some of your questions already on Slido. If you do have a question for Rowan or Harriet, hop on. The hashtag is USydLFG, and we'll try our best to cover as many questions as we can. Rowan, wanted to come back to something that you touched on, which is the interruption that COVID has generated to your preparation and to how you go about your business. I mean, you mentioned how important it is to have a rigid routine, to have regularity in how you train and do things. COVID obviously was a big spanner in the works. How have you adjusted, or how did you have to adjust to COVID in preparing for the Olympics and doing your training?
Well, it was always just a matter of just refocusing on things that I could do and trying to find the positives in that. I actually found it, to be honest, I actually didn't find it too difficult to adapt. And my strategy this season was always going into the Olympics. I don't necessarily have to be the fastest man in the world, but if I can be the best adapted athlete in the world, then I put myself in a really good position to succeed at the Olympics. And I think that was more relevant this year than ever before because of all the uncertainty. And I think amidst all that uncertainty, one of the few guarantees was that somebody was going to test positive for COVID. Somebody was going to, something was going to happen. So you had to be really strategic in terms of who you exposed yourself to, the sort of the places that you would visit, your travel plans, all of those things. And when it came to like the actual training side of things, I was very lucky in that I had been living out of home and I moved back in with mum and dad, and they helped set up a bit of a gym setup so I could, do a bit of a Rocky Balboa sequence in terms of, just like old school training. But it was good to get back to fundamentals. That's what I found. I mean, track and field, in particular the 100 meters, is not a difficult sport in that it's one foot in front of the other as fast as you can. You don't need a lot of resources or facilities to do the fundamentals really, really well. And that's what we really went back to. So I was still able to access a local track, which was open through the bulk of the lockdown and was completely empty. And it was within my 5K radius. So I was sort of just lucky in that regard. But yeah, it all came down to flexibility and ability to adapt for me. I mean, I imagine it would have been a lot harder, for example, in Harriet's situation, obviously, because you've got to be in the boat, I imagine. Whereas for me, you can sort of run anywhere. You can run up hills. You can throw tin around in any environment, your own garage. It doesn't have to be the New South Wales Institute of Sport.
Thanks, Rowan. Harriet, how did you adjust to COVID, and how did it affect you and your crew?
Yeah, so I suppose there's kind of two levels to this, an organisational level and also personal. So I think not being able to go overseas and have that international racing experience, which Rowing Australia would normally do in the lead up to an Olympic Games, was certainly very tricky. And so what Rowing Australia did is they hosted these simulation regattas around Australia, which gave us the opportunity to compete against each other, other boat classes. They did that using staggered margins. So that was, that was fantastic and great to just be able to, I suppose, simulate that. And, we also, during these regattas, we followed COVID protocols, which we were expecting to do in Tokyo. So that included mask wearing and kind of just being within the confines of our hotel room to the course. So that was great to be able to simulate that. And then I suppose personally, we were disbanded in 2020 when everything blew up with COVID. And that meant that we all had to leave our centralised training location and all go back to our own home states. I suppose the thing about being an athlete at this level is about having faith in the process. And so we certainly had faith in the International Olympic Committee that they would, go ahead and host these games unless it was absolutely impossible for them to be able to do that. I suppose the Olympics has only ever been cancelled twice, and that was during the World Wars. So we all went back to our homes, and like Rowan said, we trained out of our garages. Unfortunately, we weren't able to get on the water and row for a very long time. But rowers have a great thing called the ergometer machine, which we all absolutely hate, but there was a fair bit of time spent on those ergos in our garages before, we were able to all come back together. And I think we were all incredibly motivated to do that final push of that extra year. And in a way, I think that it I suppose was blessing in disguise for some people. That includes myself. I had a huge amount of injury in 2020, and so I actually had to sit out of the Australian rowing selection trials. So having this extra year enabled me to rehab properly and I suppose come back fitter and stronger for those selections in 2021.
So a bit of a blessing in disguise. And Harriet, I'm glad to hear that even elite rowers have a love-hate relationship with their Concept 2 ergs. Harriet, I wanted to ask you a specific question about teamwork, because you're, of course, part of a crew of 4. Can you talk us through, we may have some people on the Zoom call who are familiar with rowing and some not. Can you talk us through your specific role in that crew? Because everyone on the boat has a specific role of some sort. And can you just talk us through which seat you're in, what your role is as part of the crew, and how you work together as a crew?
Yeah, absolutely. So you're right, Tim, that, I think in rowing in a quad scull, there's very specific roles. So I sat in the 3 seat, which is behind the stroke. and in my seat, where we're often known as the meat seat. And that's because, you know, we have to put in a huge amount of power. So I suppose in my seat, it's important for me to be able to connect the rhythm which the stroke generates to the two behind me, and also just really, I suppose, lay down those watts. But yeah, I suppose, you know, I look back and reflect on our Olympic campaign, and I think that how harmonious we were as a team had a huge influence on our success. Not just the four of us, but also our coach. I remember often he would say to us, we had these weekly meetings, and he'd often say to us, look, there may be fitter, stronger, more powerful athletes at these Olympic Games, but there will not be a better team than us. And so that was, you know, was really great. And there are a few things that we did along the way. Like, for example, we spoke about if we ever had some sort of disagreement or misunderstanding, which often happens in these crew boats, we had to address the problem within an hour. So we would we'd lay it out pretty pragmatically, and then that meant that we could just move on from that. So that was really great. And I think going back to our heat, where we probably didn't perform as well as we were hoping, I think that's because at an Olympic Games, it's very easy to fall into the trap of I need to do something extraordinary here. I need to pull something out, because I suppose, you know, it's an extraordinary event. But we train every day to develop that unconscious competence. And so once you start overthinking that and trying to do something better, it never works. So from that heat to our next race, our coach just brought us in and said, look, you've only got to do 25%. That's all you've got to do. That's all you're accountable for. So just do your 25% well, and you know, the results will follow.
Really interesting to hear your reflections there, Harriet. Rowan, in your event, you're obviously racing as an individual, but do you consider yourself part of a team, and do you work with others in preparing for your sprints, Rowan?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, like with any good team, it's all about just delegating responsibility to the expert. So I would have quite like a well-coordinated team, I think. And I've always tried to seek out people who, you know, just like live by certain values that are, you know, congruent with mine. And so we work together really well, I suppose, sort of like any real, any normal business in a sense. I mean, I have a coach who really coordinates everything, and he runs my strength and conditioning. So that's all really well integrated. I have a physio, and the channel of communication between my coach, myself, and my physio is really important. You know, a sports doctor, a biomechanist, a dietitian, and I have a feeling I've a Pilates instructor, you know, like the list, it's actually quite a robust list. And I think it's so important. But I think that what is unique about my sport is that when times are good, it's so important to be able to recognize the role that everybody plays and to be able to share in that. But when you don't perform, you have to be 100% accountable yourself, you know, because at the end of the day, you're the only one out there. And it really is a sport where 1% matters, in the sense that the world's best sprinters run at nearly 12 meters a second velocity. And at that velocity, 1% is basically a meter of the race. So, or more, you know, and if you're off by 1%, you're running at 99%, you're going to get beaten by a meter, which is incredibly visible. The quality of your performance is totally measurable. It's just your time. And it means that I think you have to become very adept at fronting up to criticism, not being an egoist in that regard. You sort of find yourself in this strange position where when things are really rosy, it's all about sort of sharing it around and making everybody feel valued, because everybody in that team is really highly valued. But you also have to be willing to take 100% of the criticism. You know, you are the one that has to front up to media interviews at the end of it. You can't just pass it on to another member of the team. And in that sense, it can be quite lonely. And I'm the sort of person, I came from team sports growing up, and I always loved them. And I think I gravitated much more naturally towards team sports. It's sort of probably more ingrained in the Australian sporting psyche. And I've definitely had to learn to love the individualism of track and field, but I think it's important to maintain that team element, because you can't do it alone, and you have to defer to the experts in their given field.
Thanks, Rowan. And you've painted a picture there of a real team effort behind the scenes. I could go on with my questions, but I'm keen to get questions from our audience. And thank you, everyone, for sending your questions through on Slido. Josie's got a question for you, Harriet. She says, you talked about minor adjustments that you and the crew made after the disappointing heat. What tools do you use to adjust your mindset? And I thought it was interesting you were talking about, trusting a process, and how unconsciously you work together as a crew. That being the case, how do you actually consciously go about making a small tweak that isn't too big and disrupts the balance of the boat?
Yeah, well, I suppose that's the thing, isn't it? At that level, it's just minor adjustments. And for us, so we actually had these 3 words which resonated with our crew, and this was bold, relentless, and meticulous. And so when we came back together, we spoke. We just said, look, I think we need to go out there and just be more bold, because we kind of got left off the start, and that was probably because we didn't have a lot of international racing, just that side by side against other quads. So we had to be really bold with that, and then just relentless through that. But yeah, I suppose we, in a way, we had these regular catch-ups as a crew, and it was very businesslike, and we had spoken a huge amount about what we were looking for. And so I think that we all had a really good idea of what we needed to be doing. And so for us, it was easy, or once we kind of had someone to pull us up and say, look, I think you're kind of veering off the path a little bit, we were able to, I suppose, just come back on and just go for that.
And what about you, Rowan? I mean, can you make minor adjustments once you're in a meet, or are you only able to make minor adjustments between meets as a sprinter?
Yeah, pretty well. And I think one of the lessons I've learned over the years is that how you feel on the day is sort of irrelevant. You run some of your best races when you warm up and you feel totally flat, and there are other days where you feel like you're on fire and you just don't perform. And those there's just no chance for redemption in the 100 meters. It's just that simple. Like if you're not out with the gun, or you don't like accelerate properly, or you don't quite hit top end speed, or you decelerate too hard in the last 20 meters, like whatever it is, if it's not as close to perfect as possible, and perfection in the sport is so elusive, then you're going to be down by 1%, and you're going to be beaten by that that omnipresent meter. So it's one of those things where the adjustments are made at training, and I think that's almost like a bit of a liberating thing about competition. It's like when you turn up, you have to be able to say, well, okay, I've already done the work. This is just about executing, and that's how you really tap into that sense of relaxation that makes a good sprinter. Because those who overthink and tighten up are the ones who end up inevitably chopping their stride length too short, picking up their cadence, and spinning your wheels without going anywhere. So, you know, that's how you end up running slow.
Thanks, Rowan, which segues into the next question we've got on Slido. Question here about how both of your events involve bursts of extreme exertion. How do you go about managing your nerves on the blocks or in the boat? Rowan, let's start with you. How do you stay relaxed and manage your nerves when you're just about to burst off the blocks?
Well, truthfully, I don't really get very nervous anymore. I remember when I was like a kid going to regional meets or the state meets, and I'd go out to Sydney Olympic Park, you know, once or twice a year for the state meet, and I would just have this, you know, my stomach would just drop and I'd be so overwhelmingly nervous. And I just think that the sort of athlete that I am today, I don't get too nervous just simply because of practice and experience. I think that there's just no substitute for that. Interestingly, my experience with competition actually goes the other way. And it's something that I've even chatted to a sports psych about when, you know, we have our sessions, is that often I feel underwhelmed. And I think that it's sort of, there is no one size fits all narrative for, you know, sporting performance or whatever it might be. People just respond to different situations in different ways. And it's just all about being flexible in your strategies to be able to deal with that. So for me, often when I get to the blocks, you know, I'm not nervous and I don't necessarily have butterflies. But the flip side of that is you might not have the adrenaline, which is going to help you squeeze that last 1% out of yourself. So it's like, well, how do you deal with that? And, you know, that's sort of been a challenge that I've had to deal with in my own sporting journey. And for me, I just have this strategy where I think about my first arm out of the block. It's like cracking a whip, right? It's, if you imagine cracking a whip with your left arm or your left hand, that's the first movement that I have to think about to get out of the blocks on the gun. I try to not anticipate the gun in the sense that you're not trying to like guess when the gun's going to come, because that's how you get disqualified. But you have to want the gun. You know, you have to be wanting the gun and waiting for it rather than reacting off it. You do react off the gun, so you don't anticipate it. I probably haven't explained that very well. But the point is, you have to look forward to that moment. And when it comes, for me, it's all about whipping the left arm as fast as possible. And after that, the rest of the race is totally automated. I don't really think about anything in particular at all.
I'm getting the sense that sprinting's like Zen philosophy, Rowan. Harriet, what about you? How do you manage nerves?
Yeah, it's funny. I was always someone that used to get incredibly nervous before races, and that was something that probably affected my performance in a way. So something that I worked on with my sports psych is just kind of, again, clicking into that process. So for rowing, we often we get on the water and start warming up for about 40 minutes before our race. And that routine I've really developed to, you know, down to the last stroke. And so now for me, when I get onto the water, I kind of hone into that process, and almost like a checklist, you know, just tick off, yep, okay, done that. And it's all about, I suppose, preparing your body for that exertion. Something that used to make me incredibly nervous was sitting in those start blocks. You have to lock in about 10 minutes before your start time, and they literally count down. They'll say 4 minutes, 3 minutes, so that they're counting it down. And it's in those last probably 2 minutes, it's just completely silent. And it's something that I've taught myself to just enjoy, and kind of just, I suppose, enjoy the fact that it's just, everyone is just fully focused and you're about to go out there and just give it your best effort. It's great to hear Rowan, I suppose, talk about the fact that he just locks into that first movement, because it's exactly what we do as rowers as well. The only thing that I think about is that first pressure and release of that stroke, and from there, you know, you take that first stroke and the race just unfolds, and the nerves, they just go away.
Fascinating to hear both of you really break down your process and your thinking. The question here about doubts. Did you ever have doubts about whether you could make the Olympics, and how did you push past that? Rowan, do sprinters have doubts?
Well, I think most sprinters at face value have no doubts, but they said that's a big lie. They certainly do. It's definitely an event where egos predominate, and you might not expect that. Especially one of the things. I mean, I heard this. There's this podcast I love listening to, and one of the bits they did was how in the 100 meters, it might be the prelims, it might be the heats, but everybody on the start blocks does this one, number one, when the camera comes on them. And the punchline was basically, you must all know that you can't all be number one. Like, you have to know that's how it is. And I think when it comes to doubts, Harriet mentioned before the process, and like, it's so true. You seriously cannot overvalue emphasizing the process instead of the end result, because, and I think it's almost become so, if you went on any NBA player's Instagram or Facebook, and they're all talking about, everybody's talking about the process, but I think it's probably not that well understood by the public that well. And fundamentally for me, the way I try and frame it is, it's just about being a student. It's the same principle as being a student. It's all just about valuing a learning experience and taking the emphasis off the end result. So for me, whenever I stand behind the blocks, I just think, there's something to be learned here. There's something to be gained, whatever. And it's a privilege to be here, and I can live with the consequences. So, and I'm a very pragmatic person by nature. So I don't really overblow things. So, I think when it comes to doubts, it's just you can't, there's sort of no situation in which you really, really lose, because it's just all about learning. You're better for it no matter the result, if that makes sense.
No, it does. Harriet, you mentioned earlier that you had a bad year of injury last year. Did that lead to any doubts about whether you were going to make the Olympics?
Yeah, absolutely, Tim. I had a huge amount of doubt. So I had probably about 3 rib stress fractures in a row. And for rowers, that means a huge amount of time spent on the watt bike. So that was definitely time of rumination. And then also I had to sit out of the 2020 selection trials. So doubts is certainly something that I'm very used to. And I suppose, for me, I really try to live by just putting yourself out there and just having a go, because like Rowan said, again, you learn, your learnings come from your disappointments. And so I think that it's just so important to just have a crack. And if you don't get there, well, you're going to learn from that experience, and you're going to be better for it.
Thanks, Harriet. Time for 2 quick questions before I pass back to Clinton. A few questions coming up through the Slido about how you manage a possible trade-off between sport and your studies. You've both talked about how they complement each other, but are there times when it does involve a trade-off? And have there been times when you had to accept that you might achieve less desirable uni results by making sport the top priority? Rowan, has that been an issue for you?
Absolutely. And I think it's hard, because I think any elite or professional athlete is just hardwired to want to do the best that they possibly can. And I think the hardest pill to swallow is recognizing the inevitability, the inevitable truth that when it comes to a trade-off between how you spend your time, I probably can't compete with the world's best sprinters and the university's best law students on an equal level. because at some point there is this opportunity cost of how you spend your time. And so I just try to be really pragmatic about it. And it's like, well, I have the rest of my life to work in an office and be a lawyer, but I have this narrow window to do sport. And that is what really excites me. And I want to do everything in my power to make that worth it. And so, there are times where that has definitely affected my marks. And I just try not to stress about it, really. It's like I've made that choice. And I think as long as that is a decision that's been made autonomously and deliberately, and then you choose to live with the consequences, then I'm happy with that.
Harriet, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I've certainly had trade-offs either way. I suppose times when, look, I've only got 5 hours to do an assignment, and that's all I've got. So I try and be as efficient as possible. But then, there's also times when I've had to miss a training session here or there to study for an exam or get an assignment in. But yeah, like Rowan said, I think that it's just really important to just capitalize on this opportunity we do have as athletes. It's a very small, I suppose, window of time to just really try and capitalize on that. But then again, as I touched on earlier, I think that being a university student certainly makes me a better athlete.
Thanks.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. There's a lot of crossover. And I think I just want to add as well, Tim, a little bit of strategy and a bit of planning goes a long way as well. I mean, for me, I think the theme of my uni degree has been the Pareto principle. I have 80-20'd my way through uni. A little bit of strategy definitely goes a long way.
Good tip there for any students tuning in. One last question for you both. It's just a quick question. What's next for you? Rowan, should we be expecting to see you at the 2024 Paris Games?
Yeah, I mean, if everything goes to plan, definitely. I'll be 26 then, and that's sort of about when you're at your physical peak in my sport. So that's what I'm hoping for. I mean, there's always this specter of injury, and I've had a few injuries in the past, which have sort of derailed seasons and made it a bit tougher. But, I wouldn't change that for the world. Definitely wouldn't, I'd put a lot of value on those experiences, and I think they do well to set you up for the future. But certainly Paris, there's always something next year in this sport. Next year we have the World Championships and the Commonwealth Games. The following year we have another World Championships. And then obviously the Olympics this year are 3 years away rather than 4. So it's a jam-packed sort of Olympic cycle.
Sounds like it. And Harriet, what's next for you?
Yeah, well, I'd love to go for Paris also. I think after experiencing Tokyo, it's just that excitement and that euphoria that you experience is just addictive. And I now know why athletes just hang around, because it is just an unbelievable experience. So I'll be 26 in Paris also, and rowers actually don't really peak until about their 30s. And the reason for that is because I suppose rowing is an endurance, strength, and technical sport, and so it just takes so long to mature and to build up those skills and strength. So at the moment, I'm home in Queensland, spending time with my family, which is really nice because obviously with COVID, I haven't been able to really spend that time with them. So I'm enjoying being in Queensland, and I'm actually finishing off my OT degree. So it's been great, and it's really exciting because it's something that I feel like I've been studying forever, and I honestly cannot believe that I'm almost there. So yeah, I'm really enjoying it, and I'm slowly getting back into training to go again. And like Rowan said, it's only 3 years, and so I think you'd find that a lot of athletes who may have walked away after Tokyo are going to stick around, because 3 years really it isn't very long.
No, it isn't. Well, Harriet, Rowan, it's been a great pleasure. Thank you so much for sharing your reflections with us so honestly and candidly. And I want to wish you the best for the remainder of your studies and indeed for your athletic endeavours. But I'll pass now back to Clinton, who's going to close today's event. Clinton.
Thanks very much, Tim. And certainly on behalf of the University of Sydney, I'd really like to thank Rowan and Harriet for just a wonderful insight into your experience at the Games and also your journey, and a really inspiring conversation that was masterfully orchestrated by Tim. Certainly our university community is very proud of you both as elite athletes, but also demonstrably thoughtful and considered members of the university. Thanks very much for your time. And Rowan, in particular, enjoy the end of your fortnight of hotel quarantine tonight and your return to Sydney tomorrow. I'm conscious of the time now, ladies and gentlemen. So with that, I will close. The next Leadership for Good talk will occur later in the year with none other than our new Vice Chancellor, Mark Scott. And we're boldly aiming for a 3D in-person offering rather than a Zoom session. So please keep your eyes out for further details of that event in due course. And it'll be wonderful to get our community together in person. With that, please stay safe, enjoy the week ahead, and we very much look forward to connecting to you before too long. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, thanks, guys. Thanks for tuning in.
Thanks, guys.